Hello, this is Waldemar Januszczak, art critic, producer and presenter of documentaries. Thanks for watching Perspective, YouTube's home for classical art.
Sade, the story of a man who, with an extraordinary determination, plumbed the depths of the human soul and brought to light our worst fantasies.
Artists who've been influenced by Sade have drawn on his work, on his fantastical universe, and on his mise en scène of sexuality, the way he makes the sexual act into a piece of theatre. It's very visual, which makes for interesting images.
Ça reste très visuel et c'est intéressant pour l'image.
My work as a photographer consists of meeting people whose sexual universe can be said to resemble the Sadean universe.
To Sade, the body represents a game, a dialogue with the mind, which leads to the abyss, to vertigo. There are no limits.
The challenge is to reach, by means of thought and of writing, that state of supreme arousal.
Sade, a literary legacy, but also a lifetime of scandal. The most outrageous of all the Enlightenment figures, he repudiated God, morality, and the law.
Sade was a great one for shattering dogmas. Above all, he wanted to open doors, and he did this both conceptually and in practice. He opened the doors of the unconscious, the doors of sexuality, of the body, so that the body takes its rightful place, a place which it should never have lost, on an equal footing with the mind. He hated rules. He hated the constraints imposed by society, and that's really refreshing. He's a libertarian, an anarchist. He was totally politically incorrect in terms of his era. He attacked religion head-on, which was very brave. In our day, it's easy to attack religion, but in those days, it was a crime.
All the questions we ask ourselves about censorship, should this text or this film be allowed, become completely obsolete or ridiculous once you accept that 120 Days of Sodom can be found in every bookshop. Until you've understood that Sade's work is about freedom of thought and not about freedom to do violence, you haven't understood Sade, in my view.
He paid heavily for this freedom to think, spending 27 years in jail. And 200 years after his death, his work remains both shocking and disturbing.
Born in Paris, in the lap of luxury and plenty, I believed, as soon as I was able to reason, that nature and fortune had conspired to inundate me with their bounties. I believed it because they were foolish enough to tell me so, and this absurd presumption made me arrogant, tyrannical, and fierce.
It all began with a feeling of immense power. When Donatien Alphonse François de Sade was born on June 2nd, 1740, he opened his eyes to a world of gold, purple, and cut crystal, in a palatial residence in the heart of Paris. Here, all was luxury, splendor, and ostentation, belonging to a branch of the royal family close to King Louis XV. The Hôtel Condé was one of the most magnificent private mansions in Paris, an immense hôtel particulier, surrounded by gardens, opposite the Palais du Luxembourg.
He was surrounded by remarkable paintings and furniture and so on. It was like a mini Versailles in the heart of Paris. What's more, it was the private mansion of the princes of Condé, of the Bourbon dynasty. And so you might say that he lived there like a young prince.
It was thanks to his mother, Marie-Éléonore de Maillet, a cousin of the Condé family, that Donatien and his family lived in the palace.
They were of the royal blood, and in addition, Sade's mother was lady-in-waiting to the Duchess of Bourbon. In other words, she belonged to the very inner circle of life at court.
His father, Jean-Baptiste de Sade, was a nobleman from Provence who had come to Paris to make a career.
It seems he was a very attractive man, very intelligent, with excellent social skills, and also highly educated.
Jean-Baptiste de Sade was a diplomat and saw very little of his young son. Donatien was brought up by an army of servants with the idea that he belonged to the ruling class.
His childhood was that of the young master, to whom nothing is denied. Everything seemed possible. This way of life gradually transformed him. He grew accustomed to privilege, to luxury, to a life of ease.
I think it had a major impact on his personality, because very early on, he had the idea that the world was there to obey him.
This sense of omnipotence was soon fractured by the behavior of his mother, who suffered from depression.
There was very little contact between the young Donatien and his mother. It was as though she had withdrawn from family life.
Marie-Éléonore had never recovered from the early deaths of her first two children.
He was surrounded by a sense of loss, which can perhaps be explained by his mother's sadness and her absence.
When a mother is depressed, in mourning for a lost child, this can be a major problem for the surviving child, who feels unloved by his mother, and at the same time feels that his role is to console his mother for the loss of her other children. So that was extremely important in terms of Sade's narcissism.
But Donatien could not be his mother's savior, and he expressed his anguish in increasingly bad behavior. Brought up side by side with the young Prince de Condé, the two often came to blows.
They used to fight a lot, which was not approved of at the time. The young Donatien felt that he was superior to the young Prince of Condé because he'd been led to believe he was invincible.
Fighting the prince is not the done thing. Donatien had overstepped the mark, something he would continue to do for the rest of his life. And his excesses did not win back his mother's affections. She later abandoned him for good and retired to a convent. His father decided to take him away from Paris. He gave his turbulent son into the care of his brother, the Abbé de Sade, who lived on the family estate in Provence. For Donatien, coming to Provence was like being reborn, as he was plunged into a wild and fantastical paradise.
The young Donatien left for Provence. He went from one of the most magnificent private palaces in Paris to a sort of fortress in the heart of Provence, the Château de Saumane, the medieval and Renaissance chateau, which to little Donatien was a completely new world.
Provence at that time was very, very far away from Paris. It was several days' journey. I think a new part of him came to life there, in the sunshine. And the wild landscape.
I can quite easily imagine Sade gazing upon the skies of Provence and having a feeling of the violent intensity of the infinite.
On the Saumane estate, his family's feudal power base, Donatien was immersed in nature, but also in the fabled history of his ancestors. Far removed from the rational spirit of the Enlightenment,
Provence was seen as the Gothic province par excellence.
here his imagination had free rein and would soon be peopled with the weird and outlandish creatures of Provençal legend.
In the countryside of the 18th century, the nights were pitch black. At night, before sunrise, everything was possible. All the ghosts were still present. And it wasn't so long since there had been witch hunts, and stories were told about fantastical animals and monsters roaming the countryside, about the power of magicians and sorcerers.
The fantastical was also on display during the semi-religious, semi-pagan ceremonies that were still common in Provence at that time, when the population took to the streets in wild celebration.
At Aix-en-Provence, there was the procession of the Fête Dieu, which was shocking to the enlightened minds of the time. There were devils with 3-meter-long phalluses wrapped around their bodies. The children would chase after them and try to catch them by these penises, and so on. I think that all of Sade's anonymous works grew out of this culture. These devils which were to be seen in the Aix processions.
Devilry, the unconscious mind, and repressed desires all would burst forth in literary form 40 years later. And Donatien was introduced to the world of books by his uncle. Jacques-François de Sade, who lived at the Château de Saumane, was a priest, but he was also a man of letters, a scholar and friend of the philosopher Voltaire, and an occasional writer himself.
He possessed a magnificent collection of classical works in Latin, in French, in Italian. It was one of the most outstanding libraries in Provence because the abbé was au fait with everything that was published. So there were books on philosophy, theatre, the sciences, history, geography. At that time it was the fashion to read very widely, and there was also a small stock of erotic literature.
He may well have been a priest, but Jacques-François de Sade was also a libertine. In the Age of Enlightenment, a libertine was a free thinker who believed he must liberate his mind and his body from the dogmas of the Church in order to enjoy life to the full.
He was an 18th century priest. In other words, he was able to bend the rules.
Des accommodements avec la règle.
So that when he was at the Château de Saumon, he had a mistress or several mistresses.
Plusieurs.
In the twisting corridors and alleyways of the medieval chateau, Donatien kept his eyes and ears open. A peeping Tom. A voyeur. He saw and heard everything. And he came upon his uncle at his pleasures.
What Sade discovered in the household of his uncle, the Abbé de Sade, was that behind the appearances lay a very different reality. His uncle, the priest, on the one hand, upheld the rituals and dogmas of the church. But on the other, in his private life, behaved in a way that was totally different to what he preached.
Par rapport à ce qu'il professe.
Priest though he is, he still keeps a pair of trollops in his house. Is his chateau a seraglio? No, better. It's a bordello.
Literature, libertinage, fantasy. The major elements of the Sadean universe were now in place. At 10 years of age, Donatien was torn from Provence and his new freedoms. In 1750, he returned to Paris to live with his father, another Enlightenment man, and also a libertine, believing in freedom of thought and freedom to live as he pleased. He was a member of the free-thinking aristocracy which came to the fore on the death of Louis XIV.
The Regency period, following the death of Louis XIV, was an era of quite remarkable hedonism and cynicism in aristocratic circles. I don't think it's possible to fully understand the Marquis de Sade without taking into account that his father was absolutely the product of that era, that feeling of being completely above the law and able to do exactly what one pleases. Nothing was too shocking. Everything was possible.
When he was 15, Donatien's father introduced him to sex.
His father became a role model. Let's say he shared his predilections with his son by taking him to see his former mistresses during the holidays. And it was here that Donatien had his first experiences.
The women that Donatien's father introduced him to were women who were both intelligent and well practiced in the sexual arts.
Very quickly, father and son shared the same mistresses and women friends, such as the Princess de Rache, of whom the father wrote, "She does not find me too old, nor my son too young." Jean-Baptiste de Sade gave his son an entrée to licentious behavior and passed on to him his vision of the world and its ways. He taught that the best way to live life is to follow one's desire, and to hone that desire regardless of any moral considerations.
The Libertine Vision consists in prioritizing one's own relationship to desire and disregarding anything that might lessen that desire. In other words, reciprocal pleasure, and of course morality, and a sense of duty. The only duty of a libertine is to enjoy his pleasure.
It was this libertine world that forged the man who became the most scandalous writer of all time. The man who put the ferocity of desire at the heart of his literary work. War, violence, brutality. Donatien spent 9 years in the King's army and witnessed life in all its absurdities. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris brought to an end the 7 Years' War, which had ravaged Europe. Donatian, finally free at 23 years old, made up for lost time and embraced the life of a rampant libertine. His body seemed to be on fire. To rein him in, his father decided his son must marry as soon as possible. He must abide by the rules of his caste.
The father literally drew up what I would call a little advert, with the aim of marrying him off, with all his qualities, all his assets, and all his expectations of future riches.
His father wrote long lists of eligible young ladies, noting in the margins whether they might be suitable or not, whether their ancestry was respectable, and their dowry sufficiently generous.
Jean-Baptiste de Sade finally set his heart on the exceedingly rich Montreuil family. The Montreuils belonged to the noblesse de robe, whose nobility came from holding important judicial posts. Madame de Montreuil, Donatian's future mother-in-law, was flattered to be associated with the large and aristocratic Sade family with its contacts at court.
For the Montreuil family, it was a prestigious alliance, which is exactly what they were looking for. Monsieur and Madame de Montreuil prided themselves on their political connections and did everything possible to play off the different cliques and clans and to increase their acceptance at court.
Money in exchange for upward social mobility. The convergence of interests seemed perfect. And so, on the 17th of May 1763, in Paris, Donatian married Renée Pélagie de Montreuil. Once married, Sade changed nothing in his way of life. He continued to visit brothels, had more and more affairs, and developed a taste for an increasingly violent sexuality. On the 3rd of April 1768, this predilection turned him into a sexual offender. Place de Victoire at 9 o'clock on the morning of April 3rd. Sade was standing under the statue of Louis XIV. In front of the church of Le Petit Père, he noticed a young woman who was begging. Her name was Rose Keller. He approached and offered her work as a housemaid at his small property at Arcueil. It was in this bachelor apartment, out of sight, that he could indulge all of his vices.
As soon as she arrived, he told her to undress while he went to change his own clothes. He took everything off and reappeared wearing a sleeveless waistcoat and a kind of scarf tied around his head. I don't know if he was playing with a whip, pretending to be a slave driver chasing the dark-skinned slaves, or perhaps a pirate. I have no idea what he was playing at. But in any case, he was dressed up from head to toe. And then he said to her, a truly scary tone of voice, "Get ready to die! Confess yourself!" and so on. She was frightened to death. She said that she'd been whipped, and it was also said that he cut her buttonholes with his hunting knife.
Several hours later, Rose Keller managed to escape and filed a complaint. In her statement, she said she was brutally whipped, stabbed with a knife, and had hot wax poured over her wounds. But there is another fact which adds to the violence of the story. Sade didn't choose that day randomly for his actions. It was Easter.
It has to be said that, at the time, every French person was meant to take communion at Easter. It was obligatory. And it was even on the basis of the number of communion wafers given at Easter that the French population census was done. Something was changing in public opinion. As a matter of fact, the notion of public opinion was just starting to exist. There was a kind of exasperation at the excesses of the aristocrats. Sade's case became emblematic of all the horrors. And this was the term that was used. All the horrors, the infamies that were committed at court.
Reviled by the people, Donatien was also rejected by his caste, the Libertines. In their view, his brutality was pointing the finger at them too.
Traditionally, a great noble could afford, in a large number of cases, to be above the law. But in his case, he had a sort of angry sense of entitlement to conduct himself just as he wished, without pretending not to do so. And that was unforgivable.
The difference lay in his recklessness, in refusing to conceal his excesses. But also, and this came to characterize Sade, he was already convinced that his was a philosophically defensible lifestyle.
His philosophy of life was based on the search for a kind of selfish pleasure, which made a disturbing link between sexual pleasure and cruelty. In general, we distinguish two sorts of cruelty: that resulting from stupidity, which assimilates the individual into a ferocious beast. The other species of cruelty, fruit of extreme organic sensibility, is known only to extremely delicate persons, and the excesses it leads them into are merely refinements of that delicate nature. Sade no longer had anyone to defend him. He was imprisoned by order of the king in the prison of Pierre-Encise-Nélion. But the affair began to take on national significance. The Paris Parliament took it up and decided to have Sade brought to Paris and put on trial.
From town to town, people came to gawp and stare. Hundreds of people came, everywhere he stopped, to catch a glimpse of Sade, this horrible monster. And so Sade, whom nobody had previously heard of, became one of the most famous men in France.
In November 1768, after 7 months in detention, Madame de Montreuil, his influential mother-in-law, managed to have him released. He was forbidden to remain in Paris and took refuge in Provence at the Château de Lacoste, passed on to him by his father, who had died the previous year. At Lacoste, Sade discovered a lifelong passion for theatre. He was overtaken by a creative fury and spared no expense in practicing this new art.
In 1772, he created a theatre on the first floor of the chateau. It was quite large, measuring 200 square meters, with a foyer. We know that he had troops of actors come from Marseille.
He wrote a first play, The Wedding of the Century. He adapted and staged the free thinkers of the time, Voltaire, Diderot, Sade, and he sent out copious invitations. From Avignon to Marseille, all the aristocracy of Provence came to applaud his productions.
He wrote and produced plays and even organised a festival. Once again, he spent enormous sums of money, and again his mother-in-law was in contact with all manner of people who told her how he was spending his money.
Theatre, like writing, was of vital importance to him, and he took part in every possible way. He was an actor on stage, but he was also a director, a playwright, And sometimes he was the set designer, the stage manager, and even the stage hand. He did it all and took great pleasure in doing so.
Sade was happy. Never before had he felt so free as at Lacoste, surrounded by his wife and 3 children. All of his volcanic temperament went into his creativity. On June 23, 1772, Sade took off for Marseille to collect some money with his tall and dashing manservant Latour. But he could not resist the pleasures on offer in the big city, and he threw away his freedom by getting involved in a new sex scandal.
Marseille, c'est un port. C'est une grande ville.
Marseille was a port, a big city, and it had large numbers of prostitutes. He organized a party, an orgy, at which he gave the women pills, either aphrodisiacs or pills to make them fart, which was one of his obsessions.
Des pastilles pour les faire péter. Bon, ça faisait partie un peu de ses manies.
He whipped them, he got them to whip him, and in front of these prostitutes, he had homosexual relations with his valet.
Homosexuel avec son valet.
The trouble is, the women had eaten too many little pills, and no doubt, somewhat shaken by the whole experience, they thought they'd been poisoned. They filed a complaint and recounted everything to the police, including the homosexual acts, which were punishable by death at that time, and legal proceedings got underway.
Sade fled to Italy. In the meantime, the Parliament of Aix took over the case, and the sentence was particularly severe. The intention was to crush the arrogance of this immoral libertine aristocrat. Sade was condemned to death in absentia.
He was accused of sodomy and poisoning. Even though all the prostitutes who'd filed complaints were present at the trial, alive and perfectly healthy. But the legal proceedings went ahead, and Sade and his valet were burnt in effigy on the public square of Aix-en-Provence.
But how do you extinguish a volcano? When in Aix, his effigy is burnt like a heretic or a witch. Sade was on the run, but he committed yet another offence. He fled to Italy with his sister-in-law, the Canoness Anne Prosper de Launay, the great love of his life. The scandal was enormous. Extremely hot-tempered in everything, with a dissoluteness of imagination with regard to morals such as has never been seen before, atheist to the point of fanaticism. There you have me in brief. To repeat, either kill me or take me as I am, because I will never change. For his mother-in-law, this was too much. As ruthless as Sade himself, she pursued him relentlessly. Florence, Rome, Naples, Mount Vesuvius, Sade went everywhere in a final whirlwind of freedom. He spent 5 years on the run. In July 1776, Sade came home to Lacoste, managing to evade both the law and his mother-in-law. But on February the 13th, 1777, she had him arrested by means of a lettre de cachet issued by the king, which meant immediate imprisonment without trial. He was taken to the dungeon at Vincennes, a royal fortress a few kilometers from Paris, where the doors of cell number 6 closed behind him. He was 37 years old. He became known as Mr. Six. Immured in a damp, dark cell measuring 15 square meters, Sade was left to his own devices. But his rank allowed him certain privileges.
He sometimes had a servant. He had furniture, his own furniture, He built up a collection of books, but he was shut up alone. He said that to lock a libertine in solitary confinement was the worst sentence of all. He was condemned to practice autoeroticism, but it didn't satisfy. He managed to have prostitutes brought to him. He called this his distinctions. He found himself doubly imprisoned, within his cell and within himself. His outlet was writing.
Very quickly, writing took up all his time, initially in the form of private letters. Day and night he wrote to his wife, his only link with the outside world. He sent letters in a variety of moods. Some were amorous. This evening I'm writing with gusto, like some animal, like an ass, like a Spanish stallion. Thus I bid you farewell. Unbending. My way of thinking is the fruit of my reflections. It derives from my existence, my way of organizing things. I am in no position to alter it, and even if I were, I would not. My way of thinking is not responsible for my misfortune. The thoughts of others has caused that. In total, Sade wrote more than 500 letters in his prison cell, one of the most complete records of correspondence in French literature.
Sade's writing is perhaps the most exquisite of the whole of the 18th century. It's so dense and at the same time so subtle. It's the language of the Enlightenment elevated to its utmost intensity.
But as the months passed, he was consumed by anguish, and his letter writing was no longer enough to contain it. Locked up simply as a result of the lettre de cachet obtained by his mother-in-law, he sensed that he would never be released, and this nearly sent him mad.
He hoped he would be released, but he never was. Left to himself, he felt his body would explode. His body and his mind, you might say, absorbed all the pressure of his worries and his anxieties. This internal ferment was down to his realization that he would probably never get out of prison, that a decision had been taken to keep him locked up, that he would stay there forever, and that causes a kind of internal volcanic eruption.
His madness took the form of a manic obsession with numbers. He sought to divine his future in numbers. He began to lose his mind.
He believed that the letters he received contained numbers which would reveal the date of his release.
He was on the edge of madness. And it's very moving to see how he was affected by madness, but had the strength not to succumb.
Literature proved his savior. Sade took refuge from looming madness in the creation of an imaginary universe. The transformation was complete. At over 40 years of age, he became a writer and henceforth never ceased to assert his rebellious and radical ideas in ink.
He found a way to escape the torment by writing. It was a way of asserting himself through words which could never be silenced.
On February 29, 1784, after 7 years in jail, Sade was transferred from the dungeon at Vincennes to the Bastille, another royal prison which overlooked the poorer districts in the east of Paris. At the same time, his literary imagination went into overdrive. In October 1785, in the dead of night and in utmost secrecy, he put the finishing touches to his first major work, 120 Days of Sodom, or The School of Libertinism. In this novel, his ambition was to destroy the civilization which had put him in jail. In the preface, he wrote,
"And now, friend reader, you must prepare your heart and your mind for the most impure tale that has ever been told since our world began." Imagine that all honest pleasures are banished from this collection. When you come upon them by adventure, they will always be accompanied by some crime or colored by some infamy.
The 120 Days of Sodom is a story of imprisonment, a metaphor for his own incarceration. At the heart of the novel are four representatives of the Ancien Regime's ruling class: a judge, a clergyman, a duke, and a financier, who engage in the most horrific sexual perversions.
There are four libertines who set off to a castle in the depths of the Black Forest. The Castle of Sille. They arrive at the beginning of winter, and eventually all means of access to the castle are cut off. They destroy the drawbridge. They wall up doors and windows. The snow falls and makes all roads impassable. The place is surrounded by a sort of cradle of cliffs and ridges, which make it completely inaccessible. So that Sade says that at the end, only the birds could still make their way to the Castle of Sille.
The four all-powerful libertines live a sort of self-sufficient life for 4 months, November, December, January and February, with young members of staff, young boys and girls. A number of men he refers to as fuckers, studs, and some brothel keepers. Women who are supposed to know everything about human passions, everything that can be done in terms of sexuality.
The novel comprises a meticulous recounting of these sexual perversions, enacted upon 42 victims under the absolute domination of the debauchers and in a growing frenzy of violence.
At first, it's about masturbation, about manipulation, according to each person's level of tolerance and acceptance. But they are caught in a spiral, which goes from what is acceptable to some people to things which are less so, and then not at all. And then it tends towards bloody and murderous passions before ending with the unthinkable.
The story cuts off abruptly, as though it were impossible to go any further. A story without end, 120 Days of Sodom becomes a catalogue of atrocities.
The end of the book is not even an enumeration, it's a balance sheet. This is the number of people at the beginning, and this is how many were left at the end. No other literary text in the world works like this.
Completely non-realistic, the novel is a sort of diabolical fable, which describes the triumph of hell in order to denounce the violence of the state, carried out by four representatives of the Ancien Regime.
In my opinion, it's an accusation leveled at all regimes. An accusation against all oppressions, against everything which seeks too much control. It's an accusation against all forms of censorship, whether benign or not. It's really an accusation against everything which was stopping humanity from reaching a sort of freedom.
It was also an unveiling of the violences and the impulses, down to the most criminal, which inhabit all of us. Those aspects which Freud would study a century later through psychoanalysis and the study of psychopathic behavior and sexual perversion.
The terrifying crescendo in the 120 Days of Sodom is that the sexual objects are no longer human beings. They are subject to sexual impulses, which in fact lose their eroticism until they become purely destructive impulses.
There exists within humanity a force for the destruction of nature and the destruction of the human species itself, which we can see all around us today. In that sense, I think, Sade was a rare visionary.
Un visionnaire comme il y en a peu.
In the novel, Sade performs a kind of bloodletting of Enlightenment philosophy. Voltaire had destroyed religion, Rousseau the monarchy, and Sade reminds us of the disturbing darkness of our desires. In order to preserve his shocking text from the jailers who regularly searched his cell, Sade came up with a strategy.
He meticulously copied it out onto small pieces of very thin paper, which he glued together, one after the other, on both sides, to make a scroll, which he hid somewhere inside his cell.
It was in a crack between the stones of his prison cell that Sade hid the precious manuscript. And on July 2nd, 1789, a few days before the storming of the Bastille, he turned his chamber pot into a loud hailer and called for insurrection.
Sade roused the populace of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, shouting out, "Come and set us free, they're cutting our throats," with his chamber pot. So the governor of the Bastille asked permission to send this prisoner away because he was causing a disturbance.
During the night, Sade was transferred to the prison at Charenton. On July 14th, when the Bastille was taken, Sade was not there. The insurgents sacked the prison, including his empty cell. The manuscript of 120 Days of Sodom, the extraordinary work which had cost him so much to write, disappeared along with other texts written during the same period. For the rest of his life, Sade would mourn the loss of this novel, which he believed to have been destroyed forever. He wrote to his lawyer,
"My manuscripts, over which I wept tears of blood. Beds, tables, and chests of drawers can be salvaged, but not ideas."
But his manuscript had not been destroyed. It was found during the storming of the Bastille and immediately sold. And it then disappeared from view for over 100 years. In a quirk of fate, the controversial work came to light again when a German psychiatrist published the first edition of 120 Days of Sodom under the pseudonym Eugène Duren in 1904. In March 1790, the lettres de cachet, hated symbols of arbitrary royal authority, were abolished by the Revolution, and on the 2nd of April, 1790, Sade was finally freed. He was nearly 50, abandoned by his wife, ruined and obese. He bore little resemblance to the dashing young aristocrat of yesteryear. Prison had transformed him physically, but it had also made him into a writer, one who from now on would have to write for a living. In that new world, his class privileges had been abolished. He had to start from scratch.
Sade had to survive in a totally new world, where all the old reference points were disappearing. He was neither Marquis, as he'd been known before, nor Count, the title he'd inherited on his father's death. He was a citizen, and he tried to forge himself a new identity as a man of letters. He asked one of his correspondents to write on his envelopes, "Citizen Sade, man of letters."
He did everything possible to acquire a new reputation, by writing plays and works of history, by acting in the theatre. But it seems that the only role he knew how to play was the baddie.
Sade was unable to shed his reputation as a monster, and so he made the most of it. The man with the scandalous morals became a scandalous writer, a pornographer, and that is how he earned his living. For 10 years, from 1790 to 1800, he published his most outrageously lascivious novels, which found a wide public. In the heart of Paris, he created the biggest pornography machine in Europe.
It was the biggest pornographic publishing venture that ever existed. Because whether it was Juliette, Justine, or Philosophy in the Bedroom, these were huge publishing enterprises which he oversaw himself. The printing was done in Holland, but there were dozens of volumes to make up. The investment was therefore colossal, and the books sold.
His novels were not only pornographic, however. They were also philosophical treatises, and this is what made them so original. Orgies alternated with philosophical speeches, and it was always after a physical warm-up that the heroes started to think.
He brought philosophy into sexuality, not the other way round, and that's what's interesting. Yes, it's a complete reversal of the classical cliché, where eroticism is discussed in secret in the salons. Here, we are in the boudoir, and it's the other way round. People are philosophizing in between bouts of sexuality, and it's true that the body speaks.
To Descartes, who says, "I think, therefore I am," Sade replies, "I desire, therefore I am." In his writing, as in his life, he would never cease to proclaim that the body has its own laws, that it cannot be tamed, and that there is no thought without a body.
Once you've detached it from the dogmas in which thought had been imprisoned for centuries, and you start to think again at the individual level, Sade asked the simple question which no one else had dared to, which was, what about the body? He said not only the body cannot be educated, but the body will prevail.
Worse still, Sade said that the body that has been freed from God, morality, and the law, which prevent it from expressing its true nature, is a ferocious body. Sade shows us our dark side, and for that, we cannot forgive him.
What delicious pleasure. I was covered in maledictions and imprecations. I gave myself to parricide, to incest, assassination, prostitution, and sodomy. Oh, Juliette, Juliette.
The moral order would finally put paid to Sade's last years of freedom. In 1801, Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of France, decided he must punish the author of Justine, which he called the most abominable book engendered by the most depraved of imaginations. At 61, Sade was again imprisoned without any legal proceedings for libertine insanity. This time he was sent to the insane asylum at Charenton, where he spent the last 13 years of his life. He succeeded in finding an ultimate escape once again in theatre. For over 10 years, surrounded by madmen, he was again able to indulge his passion for theatre, staging plays, and acting alongside his fellow internees. A kind of art therapy ahead of its time. Creativity as balm for the mind, perhaps. The cream of Parisian society came to Charenton to see the monster of the Enlightenment on stage one last time. On the 2nd of December 1814, aged 74, Sade died at Charenton, utterly destitute. The infamous Marquis fell into oblivion. Until he was rediscovered in the early 20th century by the Surrealists, who saw him as a brilliant explorer of the hidden corners of the soul. From the infamous, he became the divine Marquis. Since then, he has had admirers and critics. For Sade, it was only ever a question of passion.